The radiant image of a young, talented, and admired artist seemed to envelop Qiao Renliang's life in a sort of perfect armor, a shining cloak that suggested success, stability, and a limitless future. However, when numerous comments, photographs, and posts related to his passing began to disappear suddenly, the contrast between that flawless appearance and the darkness surrounding it emerged with a disturbing force. The sensation that something was being hidden, that specific details had been carefully removed from the public eye, caused the collective opinion to feel a familiar shudder, the same one that had already accompanied other tragedies within the entertainment industry. Through digital forums, an uneasiness was repeated that grew rapidly, if similar episodes had occurred before, and if in each of them there were inexplicable points. Could these really be isolated coincidences, or was there a much deeper pattern? With every comment that vanished, and with every image that was withdrawn suddenly, the impression intensified that a complex, perhaps painful, and definitely uncomfortable story was hiding behind the shadows. It was then that the name of Qiao Renliang, a rising star and a figure very beloved by the young public, returned to occupy the center of a debate that seemed to find no rest since the day of his death. For years, his life had been presented as an inspiring tale, a promising athlete who, thanks to his charisma and his warm voice, had managed to conquer first the sporting stages and later the artistic ones. His trajectory was built on discipline, talent, and a closeness that turned him into an accessible idol, someone who not only shone on screen but seemed to do so in his daily life as well. Therefore, the impact of his departure at 28 years old was devastating. Not only because of his youth, but because of the succession of questions that opened up around his case and that, with the passage of time, far from dissipating, acquired greater intensity. What was initially presented as a tragic and sudden event began to envelop public opinion in a climate of suspicion that became increasingly thick. Comparisons with other deaths in unclear circumstances, as well as the appearance of confusing or contradictory details, added new layers of uncertainty to an episode that the public seemed to refuse to accept as closed. More than a simple premature death, the story was perceived as an enormous puzzle, with disparate pieces that did not quite fit together, and with silences that seemed more eloquent than the available information. But behind the glamour and the excuses, what mechanisms truly drive this crisis? We will analyze every detail, from the initial errors to the irreversible damages, to see how the world of entertainment functions and how an icon is redefined. Here begins the attempt to decipher what lies behind the surface, in a territory where light and shadow seem to coexist in a disturbing manner. From the early years of his life, Qiao Renliang grew up in an environment that mixed material comfort with a silent, emotional absence. His father, the captain of a merchant ship who spent long periods on the high seas, was a respected but distant figure. His mother, on the other hand, became the emotional center of the family, the refuge that provided stability in a home that sometimes seemed divided between presence and endless waiting. This dynamic deeply marked his character. It was not strange to see him behave with a maturity improper for his age, as if he understood before other children the need to sustain himself when the father figure was not by his side. The decisive change occurred during an encounter that, for many, would have been trivial, but for him transformed into an open door toward an unexpected destiny. Coach Li Yuan, a woman known for her meticulous exactingness and an almost infallible intuition for detecting talent, observed in him a distinct physical energy, a mixture of power and delicacy that was uncommon. Her critical gaze identified what the boy himself did not yet manage to understand. Under her strict but deeply committed guidance, he began to discover the sensation of elevating himself above the ground with surprising ease. Each training session turned into an experience of self-improvement, into a dialogue between effort and desire, between pain and aspiration. During adolescence, the high jump track transformed into his most intimate territory. He remained there when the sun began to set and the other students were already returning home. He continued practicing under the dim light of dusk, repeating every movement as if perfection were a promise written in the air. The sweat that ran down his forehead was not a sacrifice, but the testimony of a silent will that strengthened day after day. Those years were marked by an almost ritualistic discipline. Every fall became an opportunity to learn, and every advance fed the illusion that he could reach a future that seemed reserved for a chosen few. Recognition arrived sooner than many expected. In the year 2003, at just 16 years old, he conquered the national championship in high jump, an extraordinary achievement that caused the media to call him the young man who flew like a feather. However, after that triumph, he began to feel a weight that he did not know how to name. Expectations grew with a speed that was sometimes unbearable. He was constantly told that he would be the next great figure of national sport, although inside he understood that every victory added one more layer of pressure upon his shoulders. Despite his absolute dedication, progress became more difficult. Upon finding himself in the category of second-level national athlete, he perceived that his sports career might not reach the place everyone imagined for him. It was at that point where a crack emerged that divided his path. Instead of clinging to an uncertain future within sports, he opted to open himself to another world that had always attracted him silently. Since childhood, music had been a private refuge. His voice, with a deep and warm tone, created an enveloping atmosphere that captivated even in the most everyday spaces. When he entered the Shanghai Institute of Engineering, he found a new vital impulse in music. There, he not only stood out as a student but became the soul of a university band that ended up obtaining unexpected recognition by winning a local competition. On stage, his presence acquired a particular intensity. He sang with a dedication that seemed to reveal a complex inner world, an emotional landscape that contrasted with the serenity he showed off stage. The transition toward the artistic world occurred naturally, although also with a speed that surprised even those who knew him closely. Upon winning a national singing contest, his name began to expand rapidly. What followed was a succession of opportunities, commitments, and responsibilities that propelled him toward fame. The attention of the public, the demands of producers, and the ceaseless rhythm of the industry were shaping a scenario where every step had to be calculated. Despite this, he continued to show a quiet smile, as if the challenges did not manage to pierce the serene facade that characterized him. However, in the deepest part of his mind, almost imperceptible fissures began to form. Starting in the year 2010, the nights became increasingly long. Sleep, which previously came naturally after long workdays, began to become elusive. He spent hours looking at the ceiling without being able to close his eyes, trapped in a restlessness he did not know how to explain. The lack of rest affected his concentration and wore down his emotional resistance. To continue working, he began to resort to medications that promised quick rest, but over time, became a constant necessity. His closest circle began to notice signs that suggested profound exhaustion. Sometimes he appeared with a pale countenance, other times with a lost gaze, as if he were fighting against a thought he could not share with anyone. Even so, every time he spoke with his parents, he tried to transmit tranquility. He told them light anecdotes, everyday details, anything that avoided worrying them. It was evident that he carried an inner weight that he preferred to suffocate rather than admit. The duality between his luminous public figure and his private battle became increasingly marked, creating an abyss between what he showed the world and what he truly experienced. That contradiction, fueled by constant pressure and a culture that demanded perfection with no margin for vulnerability, began to erode his emotional stability. Prolonged insomnia led him to a state of fragility that few knew about. According to a confession to a close friend, on occasions he went several days without being able to sleep. His voice conveyed tiredness, but also a sort of silent resignation. He needed comfort, a pause, a way to escape the invisible storm that was intensifying inside him. Every call he made to his mother late at night was a desperate attempt to find an emotional respite, a connection that reminded him that there was still a safe space to cling to. In this way, the foundations of the tragedy began to form long before public opinion recognized the existence of a problem. The accumulated pressures, the duality between success and fragility, and the slow but persistent erosion of his mental health created unstable ground that would become the core of everything that would come later. What do you think of this? Comment amen below so we can continue with the unfinished stories. The night the news of Qiao Renliang's passing spread, China's digital atmosphere transformed into a whirlwind of overflowing emotions. What began as a confusing notice, coming from his partner's anguished call to the police, turned in a matter of hours into a phenomenon that paralyzed millions of people. At 6:21 on that day, the authorities received the notice that would mark the beginning of a brief and bewildering investigation. The artist's body had been found in a state that surprised even the most experienced agents, the head wrapped in multiple layers of materials and visible signs of trauma. This image, leaked fragmentarily through rumors, unleashed an immediate emotional impact that no official statement could contain. The confirmation of his death occurred that same night. What would habitually require days of investigation was closed with a speed that public opinion perceived as disturbing. The preliminary report, which indicated asphyxia and suggested suicide, generated even more doubts. The artist's followers, who had accompanied every one of his professional stages, refused to accept that a young man in full ascent with upcoming projects and pending commitments had decided to end his life without leaving an explanation. This emotional resistance opened the way to a wave of questioning that affected not only the official information, but also every detail leaked from the scene of the events. Throughout the early morning hours, social platforms began to register numbers that exceeded any expectation. Millions of users searched his name, shared messages of disbelief, and expressed a mixture of sadness and bewilderment. In a few hours, searches related to his passing reached an extraordinary magnitude. The tragedy, amplified by digital immediacy, became a national event that seemed to demand a convincing explanation. The lack of coherence between the revealed details and the official conclusions incentivized the appearance of a debate that intensified with every passing minute. While some accepted the possibility of prolonged emotional deterioration, others showed palpable mistrust. The points that did not fit multiplied. The discussion became deeper, fueled by those who claimed that the body seemed to present signs that did not logically correspond with a voluntary act. It was commented that the location of death did not coincide with the initial version. The image of a supposedly absent arm in leaked photographs, although subsequently explained by the family, contributed to the emotional climate reaching a level of uneasiness where any silence seemed a tacit confirmation of suspicion. The case thus became a brutal reflection of the speed with which public opinion can fragment. On one side were those who trusted the diagnosis of severe depression and saw in the artist's story a chain of symptoms that sadly could lead to a tragedy. On the other side, a growing group emerged that interpreted the lack of transparency as a signal that something important was being hidden. Both sides defended their positions from a mixture of pain, uncertainty, and affection toward a figure whose life had made a significant emotional impact on them. With every theory, the media climate intensified. The appearance of a vehicle that some claimed did not belong to official medical services fueled speculation even further. It was not solely about the incongruity between what was observed and what was explained, but about the speed with which certain content was eliminated from platforms. For many, that pattern of accelerated withdrawal of information suggested an attempt to control the narrative. This digital behavior, perceived as an unequivocal sign of external intervention, strengthened the idea that the official version was not sufficient to understand what had happened. Among the details that generated the most bewilderment was the prior acquisition of a plane ticket. This document, registered the day before his death, was interpreted by numerous users as a clear indication that he had concrete plans for the immediate future. The question that arose was inevitable. If he truly found himself in such a critical emotional situation, why would he have organized a trip that implied work commitments and meetings that he himself had confirmed days before? The contradiction between planning and fatality was too great for many admirers who perceived this act as a loose thread impossible to ignore. While the public examined every fragment of information, testimonies began to appear that complicated the panorama even more. Some claimed that days before his passing, he had been seen using long-sleeved clothing, even in the middle of summer, as if he wanted to hide marks on his skin. Others mentioned expressions of extreme tiredness that, interpreted in hindsight, seemed like signs of devastating emotional exhaustion. The narrative that emerged oscillated between two opposite poles, that of the man who had been fighting against silent wear and tear for years, and that of the artist trapped in external circumstances he did not control. At the same time, the constant reformulation of theories fueled a collective state of confusion. Every version added one more layer of complexity. Speculation intensified when photographs of a private celebration began to circulate in which he appeared accompanied by influential figures from entertainment and business. The relationship between these images and the date of his death was interpreted as an indication that perhaps he was not alone in the hours prior to the outcome. Although no conclusive proof existed, the mere association between his presence at the party and the subsequent tragedy was sufficient for part of the public to insinuate the participation of third parties. In the midst of this tension, close friends, family members, and former colleagues found themselves involuntarily dragged toward the center of the media hurricane. Each one of them became an object of public scrutiny. Any gesture, any silence, any ambiguous statement ended up being interpreted as one more piece of a puzzle that society was determined to complete. Actress Chen Qiao, one of his closest friendships, received unfair criticism for not immediately publishing a farewell message. Her decision to travel to accompany the artist's parents was, paradoxically, used by some as an argument to question her intentions. The tragedy, instead of uniting the public in collective mourning, became a space for emotional confrontation. During those days, the figure of Qiao Renliang remained wrapped in a double reflection. On one hand, the memory of the brilliant artist whose career had illuminated the musical and television scene. On the other, the difficult image of a young man who, even after his death, continued to be a prisoner of contradictory interpretations. The networks, converted into the main stage of the discussion, amplified this division with an intensity that had rarely been observed in similar events. As the official investigation advanced, the doubts did not disappear. People expected an explanation capable of reconciling the facts, but the answers that arrived were brief and did not manage to dissipate the uncertainty. The tragedy ceased to be an isolated episode to become a collective phenomenon that revealed, in an almost painful manner, the fragility of the relationship between truth, perception, and silence. With the passage of days, the death of Qiao Renliang ceased to be merely a tragic fact, to become a disturbing mirror reflecting a pattern that few dared to mention out loud. The tension that had flooded the networks did not dissipate after the official statements. On the contrary, it grew silently, like an underground current traveling from initial disbelief to a deeper suspicion. The data provided by the authorities, although structured and presented with apparent clarity, failed to reconcile the series of contradictions floating in the air. Each explanation seemed to generate new questions, as if the truth were a terrain that receded with every step. It was in that charged environment when public opinion began to remember, almost spontaneously, other cases that had shaken the Chinese entertainment world. Names that some time ago had provoked the same sensation of bewilderment resurfaced in conversations that multiplied minute by minute. The passing of Qiao Renliang was no longer perceived as an isolated episode, but as one more piece inside a vast and disturbing puzzle. The most attentive users pointed out a common point that chilled the blood of many. Several of the artists who had died in equally mysterious circumstances had been linked to the same management company. The first connection pointed out was that of Bu Menglong, whose case had provoked an energetic debate due to the apparent incongruities between the official version and the rumors that circulated. His death, attributed to an accident related to alcohol, hid details that many considered dubious, especially due to the subsequent appearance of business documents related to activities that had nothing to do with the show business industry. Added to this was the passing of Ban He, a young singer who had broadcast live and published new music a few days before dying suddenly. The inexplicable delay in the official announcement of her passing increased the uneasiness, leaving a space that the public filled with increasingly complex theories. The third piece of the pattern was even more shocking. The actress Nian Chao, whose body was found after a fall from a great height, appeared in a scene so bewildering that even professionals most accustomed to extreme situations were surprised. Her condition upon being found seemed to defy any simple description. The absence of clothing, the prolonged silence of the agency that represented her, and the fact that the investigation did not clarify several essential points created an emotional climate that resurfaced with force when related to the case of Qiao Renliang. The coincidence that united the four artists fell upon the same management company, Tianyu Media. For some, this data did not necessarily possess a deep meaning. For others, it constituted a trigger that made it impossible to discard the possibility of a more complex structure behind these tragedies. The question that emerged was not whether or not a global explanation existed, but why so many deaths of young talents, all with promising careers and apparently favorable contexts, had occurred under such a similar climate of confusion and silence. In this point, the narrative reached its darkest instant. The public, who initially had reacted from pain, began to articulate a much deeper uneasiness. the sensation that young artists were exposed to pressures, obligations, or environments that remained hidden from the public eye. The idea of an inaccessible system operating beneath the visible surface of fame became a recurring theme. It was not about direct accusations, but about a collective perception marked by the accumulation of fragmented indications that gathered together showed a disturbing figure. For many, the case of Qiao Renliang represented a turning point. His image as a talented young man, affectionate with his family and disciplined with his profession, contrasted in a dramatic way with the darkness of the end. The contradictions between his previous behavior, the travel preparations, the signs of anxiety, and the scene in which he was found created a narrative so complex that it resulted impossible to reduce it to a single and definitive conclusion. Public opinion, trapped between respect for the artist's privacy and the need to comprehend the incomprehensible, submerged itself in a reflection that transcended the individual case. Meanwhile, the silence of some figures and the appearance of others, who claimed to have confidential information, fueled the sensation of being before a mystery whose resolution seemed increasingly distant. The succession of deaths, so similar in their atmosphere that it seemed the same script was being repeated, left the audience with the impression that they were facing a hidden structure, a mechanism that could not be seen but whose effects were impossible to ignore. That perception, more emotional than rational, consolidated the climax of this entire story, the moment the individual tragedy transformed into a collective question regarding the real functioning of the entertainment industry. At that point, the analysis ceased to be a simple reconstruction of facts to become a deeper search. The public began to ask themselves if the visible truth was really the complete truth. The accumulation of coincidences, the lack of transparency, and the speed with which some narratives were closed generated a shared feeling of alert. The question that began to repeat itself was no longer what had happened, but what elements had not been revealed. And it is here, in the midst of this emotional tension, where the story reaches its illuminating break. It is not about affirming or denying theories, but about recognizing that the complexity of these tragedies points towards something that requires a more attentive examination. The public discovered that, behind the perfect image of young artists, there exists a silent machinery that conditions, pressures, and, in some cases, swallows those who do not manage to sustain themselves within it. The death of Qiao Renliang, upon connecting with these other stories, ceased to be a singular event and passed to form part of a deeper reflection on human fragility in an environment that does not always allow for showing vulnerability. The uneasiness that remains open, more than an accusation, is an invitation to look with greater honesty at the invisible spaces of success. What do you think of this? Comment amen below so we can continue with the unfinished stories. The echo of Qiao Renliang's life continues to resonate in those who admired him and in those who, even without knowing him personally, felt that his light had left a deep mark on the emotional landscape of a generation. His trajectory, marked by a meteoric rise and an end that remains wrapped in uncertainty, invites reflection on the price that sometimes hides behind public visibility. The success he projected on stages and in front of cameras failed to protect him from a silent vulnerability, a fragility that rarely finds space in an environment where strength seems to be demanded as an indispensable requirement. In the collective memory remains the image of a young man who knew how to conquer the public with his artistic dedication, his discipline, and his human closeness. His career, although brief, left moments that defined an era of renewal in music and television entertainment. However, among the shadows of that same memory also resides the painful realization that fame can coexist with intimate suffering that hides under smiles and quiet gestures. The apparent contradiction between his vitality and the tragic outcome reveals a paradox that continues to question those who seek to understand him. From a broader perspective, the story of his death highlights a debate that is not limited to an individual case. It points toward a complex reality in which artists, even at the peak of their popularity, face pressures that the public rarely perceives in their full magnitude. The difficulty in showing weakness, the expectation of maintaining a flawless image, and the ceaseless rhythm of work contribute to generating an environment where emotions are usually relegated to the background. The lack of space for vulnerability turns every emotional fissure into a risk that, without adequate attention, can lead to irreversible consequences. Although official investigations offered an explanation, The persistence of questions suggests that the truth, on occasions, does not present itself as a clear line but as an incomplete mosaic. The doubts that surrounded Qiao Renliang's death, as well as the disturbing coincidences with other cases of young artists, became a reminder of the delicate role that public perception occupies in the construction of any narrative related to famous figures. The tension between what is known and what will never be clarified reflects the difficulty of accessing the totality of facts in a medium where information leaks, fragments, or disappears without explanation. The legacy he leaves is not limited to his artistic work, but also includes a significant lesson on the importance of emotional health and the need for a more compassionate environment for those who live under the constant gaze of the public. His story invites us to ask how the relationship between society and its idols could be transformed if there were greater recognition of the human complexity behind every famous face. This questioning, more than a definitive conclusion, constitutes an opening toward a continuous reflection on the way in which those who occupy a visible place in contemporary culture are judged, demanded of, and accompanied. Looking forward, there remains the hope that tragedies like his will drive more honest conversations about mental well-being and the structures that sustain or weaken young artists. The memory of Qiao Renliang persists as a call to understand that fame guarantees neither balance nor protection. His life, intense and fleeting, reminds us that vulnerability forms an essential part of the human condition, and that the recognition of this truth can become the first step toward significant change. If you wish to delve deeper into any aspect of this story or explore the connection with other similar cases, I will be ready to continue.